My name is Michael Turgeon. I am delighted to be here speaking to you all tonight about the results of my culminating research project. Took a little bit of a different approach. Mine is more of a quantitative statistical data analysis deep dive in the style of like an academic journal article. And the topic of my research is the intersection of the health effects of pollution exposure as measured by various different variables, as I'll get into, versus academic achievement in California schools as measured by standardized tests. So basically trying to answer the question, to what extent are California school kids being held back in school due to their minds and bodies being poisoned by the various forms of pollution that we are exposed to on a day-to-day basis. All right, so getting into it, the graph on the right there is a simple correlation between a aggregate measure of pollution exposure and standardized test scores relative to the federal standard. And boom, very clear, right? Question answered. We can all wrap this up and go home. But obviously, correlation versus causation and all that. And just because you can show that the school districts that are doing worse on tests are also have higher levels of pollution, you're not done yet, because there's so many other variables that also correlate with both of those two, namely race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status. So in California, you can see on the chart on the right, it's very clear that the areas of the state with the highest pollution burden are typically low-income communities of color, a lot of which are in the Central Valley, but also if you zoomed in, you'd see some in urban areas like in Los Angeles and West Oakland and stuff like that. Also, the same areas that are lagging behind the rest of the state in standardized test performance. And even on a macro level, I wasn't able to put this chart on the slide here, but California is one of the worst performing states in the United States on various measures of K through 12 standardized testing. Also is egregiously bad in terms of air pollution. One of the only areas, like the Central Valley of California, is one of the only areas in the entire United States that is in critical non-attainment status for various measures of air pollution. So, but again, you just overlap those together. It doesn't really answer your question of like, to what extent is pollution contributing to academic harm in California schools. So, just to briefly go over the theoretical basis of this, air pollution can give you asthma, other respiratory illnesses, probably exacerbates the effects of COVID. There's outcoming research on that. Indoor air pollution, actually, some public health research shows that it directly causes cognitive impairment. There's people that have looked at office workers on smoky days and shown that they pretty definitively perform worse. And the same can be said of school children taking a standardized test. There's been a lot more emphasis on sort of lead poisoning, like through water, air, like Flint lead crisis, lead and gasoline in the 1980s, stuff like that. But not a lot of research on other pollutants and trying to track their connection to performance in the classroom. There's a few out there, mainly on air quality, but for several measures of pollution, my study is the first one that I found that actually tries to put a number on this. So my methodological approach, don't need to get too caught up on this, but the way you control for all those confounding factors and, are able to essentially put a number on, say like X% of the variation of California test scores is due to pollution versus the other factors, is you basically just have to get a ton of data and you crunch it all together in statistical software, which essentially fits like a 30-dimensional line through all the various parameters that you have, and essentially can isolate the effect of each individual variable that you put into the model. So I used 9 years of test score data, which also includes critical covariates about, like, for each school, their median income level, their demographics, their percent special education students, percent of students on free and reduced price lunch, all these other factors that are known or suspected to influence test score performance. So you can crunch that all together with a bunch of pollution data. I isolated these 7 specific pollution variables drawn from CalEnviroscreen, which is a notable tool already used a lot to inform policy in California, and was able to crunch that all together in a fixed effects panel regression model, which is a fancy way of saying that you also include variables just for the district itself and the year itself. So if there's any idiosyncrasies of like, oh, it was a recession, or oh, this district has bad principals or something, like all of that is controlled for. And so essentially my model was able to capture about 90% of the total variation in test scores, which is pretty good. And that gives me a fairly high level of confidence that the results I found for the pollution variables are approximating reality. So you don't need to worry about any of that, but just giving you like a little snapshot of kind of what the output of the statistical model looks like. And essentially the little numbers with the stars next to them means that for these 3 of the 7 pollution variables that I studied, these 3 have a fairly high level of confidence that they're having a small but meaningful negative impact on standardized test scores in California public schools. And I could explain what those other rows are and honestly spend like hours doing that, but I will spare you all that drudgery, and we will move on to sort of a overview of what the actual effect sizes were and what that means. So after running the model several different times with kind of tweaking the specification in various ways, you call that a robustness test to sort of say like, oh, are my results robust to doing the model in different combinations of various variables. And after doing that, my most confident findings are that PM 2.5, which is fine particulate matter in ambient air, like if it's a smoky day or a hazy day, that's high levels of PM 2.5. High levels of PM 2.5 are having a significant negative impact on reading scores. Solid waste facilities like landfills or scrap metal recyclers and other toxic things I wouldn't want to go to school near, they're having a negative impact on math scores. And finally, this water quality variable in Cal EnviroScreen called groundwater threats, which represents a group of common pollutants in the built environment, like leaking storage tanks and various other nasty things that can get into the groundwater. Sort of, there we go. Yeah, groundwater regulation, very much important. This is another sort of feather in that cap, I guess. But being in proximity to those pollution sources is likely having a negative impact on math scores. And when you turn that in terms of standard deviations, which is a statistical way to sort of put everything in the same units, you can say going from average air pollution to like above average air pollution, very roughly speaking, holds back your reading scores by about 3%. Going from average to above average in groundwater threats is holding back your math scores by 1%. And going from average to above average in proximity to solid waste facilities is holding back your math scores by about 2%. So each one of them not huge, but you aggregate them all together and consider other things that I wasn't able to capture. And this is probably a underrated determinant of educational performance in California. And of the few studies that did look at air pollution previously, the results I found for PM 2.5 are pretty closely in alignment, which gives me added confidence that what I found is legit. Yeah, so interaction effects, this is where it gets kind of crazy, is that, it's, if you want to really be thorough, it's not enough to just say that this is a linear relationship that uniformly affects every student in the same way. There are various reasons why the effect would vary depending on where and who is being exposed to pollution. And these are actually very interesting findings that the per unit effect of particulate matter is 6 to 10 times worse in majority Black school districts in California, of which there are few. The highest percentage Black of any school district in California is about 70%, which is lower than some other states, but also a modest effect of being in a rural district. And interestingly, an opposite direction effect in majority Hispanic Latino districts, which again, this is novel research. No one's really looked at this question before. And so further research is needed to sort of tease out the reasoning here. And again, this is a per unit effect. So in some, both Black districts and Hispanic Latino districts have more pollution and worse academic outcomes, but per unit, sort of like the sensitivity of that to each, whether you're adding or subtracting 1 unit of pollution, that sensitivity varies a lot depending on where and who you're talking about. And my working theory for this is that the effect in majority Black school districts is due to a history of land use discrimination, where existing Black communities were involuntarily saddled with pollution sources sort of in the early half of the 20th century. While all else being equal, like if you hold income constant and other factors constant, if you're an immigrant arriving to the state of California, you will choose not to live next to the iron smelter, and instead you'll live somewhere more pleasant. So that's my working theory, but again, it needs more investigation to figure out what exactly is going on there. And I just include this, anyone that's had classes with Rob or urban planning is familiar with the history of redlining, which has kind of become a catch-all term for housing discrimination that has really shaped the urban environments of this country. And this awesome report by the California Environmental Protection Agency showed that redlined areas in California were also way more likely to have some of the worst forms of pollution in the built environment. And again, not of their own free will. Like a lot of this can be tied directly to discriminatory land use practices. In fact, we are in a redline community right now on the west end of Sacramento. That was once one of Sacramento's thriving multicultural hubs called the West End in the early 1900s. And then it was all bulldozed for freeways and office buildings. And now we're like less than a mile from the rail yards, EPA Superfund site. We're less than a mile from the Chevron fuel terminal. We're at the interchange of I-5 and I-80. And we're less than a mile from one of the worst performing elementary schools in the Sacramento area. So I'm not saying, it's one causes the other, but, there's something there. So policy implications, don't worry about the math, but I just did some kind of quick calculations there to show that compared to some other more commonly prescribed educational interventions, like class size reductions, air filtration for the effect size that I found is remarkably cost effective on a per dollar basis. Again, these are rough calculations and, it can be skewed one direction or another, but it seems like from the research that I've seen that it'd be tough to beat air pollution on a per dollar basis compared to what we're doing right now. Like I said, it's very pressing that California works to improve standardized test scores for many reasons. So ideas for legislation: you could roll out some state-sponsored pilot programs to increase the level of air pollution filtration in California public schools. And the real bold approach would be to just set a regulatory standard. Actually, testing for indoor air pollution is not that hard. And if you actually just set a regulatory standard that say, hey, if your classrooms are below X level or above X level of particulate matter, you need to install air filtration or otherwise. So running out of time here, but a lot of unanswered questions remaining from my research. As I said, that's kind of the nature of the beast. There were other pollution variables I wanted to look at that I wasn't able to for various methodological reasons that are important in California, like pesticides, certain classes of industrial toxins, and other sources of lead exposure. And the final point I just want to make is that I think in a lot of our discourse of the determinants of educational outcomes, we often focus on socioeconomic status, like family income, which enables resources that help kids in school. Well, to some extent, socioeconomic status and your income is influenced by your lifetime pollution exposure because that impacts your lifetime earnings. So there's sort of this generation over generation cyclical effect that I think is super underrated and I wasn't able to capture in my research, but future research could try to tease that out. So that's all I have. Thank you. Rob's probably mad at me, but is there time for a question or two? What question? There we go.
That was dope as hell. I worked in MPPA.
Hey, right on, man.
That was awesome.
Right on.
Probably in the MPPA article earlier this year by Bill Rain and Jang.
Yes, I cited that in my, I cited that.
Economics just updated their episode on this like 2 months ago.
Oh, really? Okay, I will check that out. Yeah, Gilrain has 2 papers, one from 2020 and 2022 that were pretty influential in setting up my research. So you're on it. All right, thanks everybody.